Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Landscape Conservation in Action webinar. My name is John Peterson, and I am on the staff for the Network for Landscape Conservation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's conversation. Really looking forward to being joined by Catherine Doyle-Capitman in a few moments to offer perspectives on fostering local stakeholder engagement and collaborative landscape conservation planning. I wanted to start with just a word from the network. The network launched in 2011 and is a national umbrella group and leading voice for advancing collaborative landscape conservation. And what the network really strives to do is to connect people to ideas and innovations and to each other. I like to describe the network as a community, much more than an organization. And we're a community that is connected by shared work, the work of collaborative landscape conservation. And we're connected by a shared desire to improve our ability to do that work. And in that vein, and in the interest of connecting people to ideas and innovations and to each other, we've launched this Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series. And really happy to bring today's event forward. It's always a pleasure to be able to introduce a friend, and I'm super excited to be able to do so today. As I noted at the top, we're joined today by Catherine Doyle-Capitman. Catherine is a national level social scientist with the U.S. Forest Service's National Forest Service Forest System, and has more than 20 years of experience working in resources conservation. Her background is biology and human dimensions of natural resource management and program evaluation. Catherine joined the Forest Service in 2018, but previously I worked in a variety of capacities with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a social scientist researcher. So with that, Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you carry us forward into today's conversation. Just a note to participants, please feel free to use the chat box and the question and answer box to pose any questions to Catherine, and we'll pick those up after Catherine's presentation and have a bit of a Q&A and back and forth with Catherine at the end of her conversation. But now, Catherine, I'll just turn it over to you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, John. It is wonderful to be here with you. Thank you so much for the honor of being able to speak to this fantastic community of practice. I've been involved with the Network for Landscape Conservation since 2014 when you guys had the fantastic conference in Washington, D.C. So it's a real honor to be here with you. And Jonathan, just as a check, you can see my first slide?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So the work I'm going to be presenting on today was derived out of my doctoral dissertation research at Cornell University and was supported by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, their Human Dimensions branch out of the refuge system. And so what I'll be talking about is primarily research that led to the development of a practitioner's guide. And so I'll start with a little bit of framing and introduction, dabble in a little bit of theory, but don't worry, we won't get too theoretical. And then just really move into some pragmatic thoughts about how to functionally and effectively and respectfully engage local stakeholders in landscape conservation planning processes. So as we in this community all know, contemporary environmental challenges, including habitat fragmentation and loss, the spread of invasive species, wildfires, drought, and flooding, are causing incredible and unprecedented challenges to the conservation community that has really underscored the fact that conservation can't be implemented within jurisdictional boundaries or through unilateral organizations within their own structures and silos. Collaborative conservation and landscape conservation is inherently needed to address modern environmental challenges. And so, as we know, and just like putting a little bit of terminology here, I'm using the term collaborative landscape conservation, meaning work that is transboundary, crossing jurisdictional boundaries, is partnership based, is based in, folks coming together around common goals and making commitments to achieve common goals together through doing individual work on their part of the organizations and individuals, and is polycentric, by which I mean that there's no kind of no central governing power, right? No individual, no organization is the seat of power necessarily. So that doesn't mean that there isn't power imbalance inherent in collaborative landscape conservation, but it's the idea that it's not one organization that everybody's coming to join with, and they're leading the effort. It's really polycentric in terms of the distribution of power in the development and planning process. So just a couple of examples that we may very well know of collaborative landscape conservation initiatives in the United States. Joint ventures, which were migratory bird joint ventures. And as a disclaimer, I'm sitting here in Washington, D.C., where the cicadas are singing and the humidity is about 400%. And if you hear some planes, I live on the Potomac River, which is used as a navigational point for the airport. So apologies in advance if there's a little bit of background noise. So getting back to the slide. So we have the Natural Resources Conservation Service's landscape initiatives, the landscape conservation cooperatives, which were largely sunset in 2017, but there are a number of them that are continuing on, largely thanks to the support of non-governmental partners. The U.S. National Heritage Areas, desert fish habitat partnerships, the Greater Sage Grouse Initiative. And from the perspective of the Forest Service, we have an initiative called Shared Stewardship, which is based on the concept of finding common priorities with partners and working cross-boundary at ecologically meaningful scales. To date, the work in shared stewardship has primarily been engagement with state governments and the federal government, but we're working to explore how we can expand our engagement beyond the states. So just a little bit of thinking about kind of the fundamental process of collaborative landscape conservation. So collaborative landscape conservation planning is conducted by development teams, right? There's individuals that are committed to coming together to plan for the desired future condition of landscapes. So those are folks that are committed to those development teams, and they're usually relatively small groups. The collaborative landscape planning process leads to the co-production of landscape conservation planning products, such as landscape conservation goals and objectives, large-scale priority conservation and management areas, or decision support tools that can inform resource management at the local level. Those planning products are then distributed to end users, or individuals, networks, and groups that are actually doing management on the ground. They can take the planning products from collaborative landscape conservation planning processes and use them to inform local management plans, which are then implemented into action. And as a result of that action and that implementation, landscape conservation goals can in aggregate be achieved. So as fantastic as that whole model of collaborative landscape conservation moving from large scale planning to implementation sounds, there are some really fun to that process. Fundamentally, how do you move from setting landscape conservation, developing tools, to informing management plans, to implementing management? That's a really difficult process, in large part because planning and implementation happen at different institutional and geographic scales. So collaborative landscape conservation planning happens at large scales, such as the entire area of the Great Lakes, or for the landscape conservation cooperatives, which I studied, the Great Lakes coastal wetlands, which went all the way from Saginaw Bay to Western Lake Erie. Right? So these huge landscapes, but you can't actually make a plan for a whole landscape that has a mosaic of land ownership and use. Whatever you come up with out of that planning process has to be adopted by local management practitioners into management plans so that in aggregate conservation goals at the landscape scale can be achieved. And that translation is a very difficult one. Really fundamental, right? So we spoke about the idea that local management planners and practitioners actually have to implement the work. And so local stakeholders end up being these critical links to whether or not management is actually implemented on the ground. And by local stakeholders, I mean individuals, networks that operate at the ground to actually touch the soil or inform how it's managed or how resources are managed. They have vested interests in how conservation is implemented and what conservation goals are pursued. And they have the power, whether political, social, or financial, to impede or support conservation adoption or management adoption. So they really are these critical, very powerful players, and particularly powerful amongst local stakeholders when it comes to conservation implementation from the perspective of landscape conservation are the potential end users of the landscape conservation planning products, such as those, the habitat prioritizations, the assessments that are done, the different landscape goals. These potential end users are the ones who would adopt those planning products and use them to influence local management. And so these end users are the ones that would influence, develop, and implement management, and may use the planning products, but they may or may not use the planning products that are developed through landscape conservation, and therein lies the rub. So there are a huge range of benefits from engaging local stakeholders in landscape conservation planning processes, even though local stakeholders operate at such a different institutional and geographic level than the level at which conservation planning at the landscape scale is often conducted. Engaging local stakeholders promotes good environmental governance, a very core fundamental principle, because it enhances inclusivity, it enhances fairness in the process and the outcome of the process. It makes the process more transparent. It fosters forward-thinking, planning that's not just necessarily myopic to a single species or a single resource, but actually thinks more holistically about the needs of local sociopolitical realities. And it makes the planning process more legitimate from the perspective of those who would be impacted by management actions or who would be impacted by them. It also fosters social learning, meaning it enhances the relevancy. Engaging local stakeholders in planning and large landscape planning enhances the relevancy of decisions to local stakeholders, meaning that they can better understand the planning process and how it's being conducted. And they can also ensure that there are adequate benefits and the needs of local stakeholders are served through the planning process just by being involved. Engagement of local stakeholders in landscape conservation also fosters stakeholder commitment, It fosters a sense of ownership and awareness of environmental threats. And that in turn can increase capacity for transboundary conservation when more folks are aware and when more folks are committed to addressing conservation issues. But if they were not engaged in the planning process, they might have not been aware of these issues, and they may have not been motivated and to engage around these conservation actions. And ultimately, and most importantly, from a lot of perspectives, engaging local stakeholders enhances the likelihood of implementation of management actions that support landscape conservation goals, And that's really critical, And so just thinking about, so what if you don't engage local stakeholders? What's the result of not engaging local stakeholders? Well, a major result are problems of fit. And these are mismatches between the interests, needs, knowledge, and capacities of those developing landscape conservation goals and planning products, and those of end users responsible for planning and implementing management actions. And so I'm just going to go into a little bit of thoughts about what problems of fit really look like on the landscape. So drawing on a great model that was developed as part of the landscape conservation design process in the Connecticut River watershed of the Hibernian warbler habitat persistence index, where the habitat persistence is lower in the hotter areas, the more red areas, and higher in the blue areas. And so I hope you're all really, really impressed by my GIS skills here, which are clearly non-existent. So I just put these shapes on the map to kind of demonstrate theoretical administrative boundaries, even though administrative boundaries in terms of ownership would be much smaller than this, but just for the purpose of elaborating around these problems of fit. All these different squares might constitute different ownerships for different parcels and that are managed and used differently. So an institutional problem of fit is where there's a lack of authority to implement management actions across the landscape because you haven't included all the managers that would be relevant to achieve conservation goals, So if a process only engaged kind of the usual suspects, maybe federal and state partners, a couple of NGOs, you might have a really kind of non-contiguous mosaic of ownership that you could potentially implement your management on in terms of who's engaged in the process in the first place, So if you're only accounting on your development team to implement management where they have authority, you'd be missing huge gaps in the landscape. And by engaging local stakeholders, you can potentially fill in all these white spaces and enhance the amount of contiguous area where you can achieve conservation goals that support landscape conservation. Scale discordance problems are where there's an inadequate or incorrect data and decision support tools are being developed to promote actionable management plans. So issues like a tool not addressing the needs of end users, folks not at the local level not having the expertise to use really technical tools, or the data that's informing tools not being granular or accurate enough for it to be trusted by local stakeholders for adoption into local management planning. So another significant disadvantage that's created by a lack of local stakeholder engagement in landscape planning. And one last scale problem of fit that can result from lack of stakeholder engagement is cross-scale dynamic problems, which are a lack of socio-political feasibility of conservation goals due to a lack of consideration of the dynamics across geographic and institutional levels. So as an example, urban centers, as we know, are seats of political and social power. But in some cases, areas that are more than 50% hardened, like urban and stakeholders therein, may be excluded and not necessarily considered in landscape conservation planning. However, folks in those urban centers could be critical partners in getting conservation within an entire landscape implemented, right? They could be important political figures, they could be important funders. And so if we're not considering the folks in the urban centers, maybe we're not truly operationalizing as much as we could how much land and resources we could conserve and take action around. So one of the biggest problems that come from problems of fit are planning implementation gaps, right? Where conservation goals and planning products have been developed, but they're not being adopted into local management plans. And these are really pernicious issues because they waste time, they waste money, and they degrade and undermine partnerships, right? If you're sitting there for 2 years in a planning process that leads to no implementation, it's very likely going to reduce the likelihood that you'll want to engage in a comparable conservation planning process moving forward, right? And so as we kind of are circling around here, local are critical in reducing the likelihood that implementation gaps occur. But it seems really fantastic and advantageous to engage local stakeholders in landscape conservation. There is a fundamental lack of basically inherent knowledge, awareness, sense of awareness of how to engage these stakeholders. And this is exactly what the research that I conducted sought to address. Specifically, the research question that I pursued was when, where, and through what mechanisms can the values, interests, and knowledge of local stakeholders be most effectively integrated into collaborative landscape conservation planning processes? And in order to do this, I'll tell you a little bit about my methodology here. Conducted a very, very extensive literature review into organizational behavior, collaborative decision-making, understanding how different landscape conservation efforts around the world have engaged local stakeholders and what strategies they've leveraged. I then conducted 40 scoping interviews with the coordinators of 30 landscape conservation initiatives to better understand how they consider social data and local stakeholders in landscape conservation planning. I then conducted 115 case study interviews that focused on the landscape conservation design process that was implemented through landscape conservation cooperatives, which were basically the way that they sought to articulate conservation, desired future conditions for landscapes within the landscape conservation cooperative landscapes. Sorry, how many times can I say landscape there? So in that research, in those case studies, I focused on 3 different landscape conservation design efforts. That was in the Connecticut River watershed, the Great Lakes coastal wetlands, and the Green River Basin. And I conducted interviews with 55 development team members, so those folks formerly involved in landscape conservation planning processes, 50 end users, those are potential or current end users of the planning products that came out of these landscape conservation design efforts. As well as just to kind of round things out, I interviewed 10 alternative landscape conservation design coordinators. So folks around the country that were also involved in landscape conservation design. And that big list on the right represents some of the end user organizations and affiliations that I spoke to during this research. So that included, county governments, soil and water conservation districts, public lands offices, energy development companies, environmental NGOs, federal land managers, land trusts, and many more. And a primary outcome of this research was a practitioner's guide that has a couple different components. It has a portion of it focused on local stakeholders' preferences for engaging in landscape conservation planning processes. So specifically what we heard from those end users about their preferences, challenges associated with lack of stakeholder participation, best practices for engaging local stakeholders and considering social data in landscape conservation. And then guide basically social data collection, how you can collect social data as a whole compendium of questions in the end of the practitioner's guide, as well as an insight on how to derive secondary data that you don't have to collect yourself. And for today's purposes, we're going to focus on the best practice recommendations for engaging local stakeholders in landscape conservation design. And that's what we'll be focusing on for the rest of our time together. So one thing that we had to do at the beginning of this, starting to create best practice recommendations, was really to understand what is the structure, what is the process generally that landscape conservation is planning goes through. And not surprisingly, it's basically, ideally at least, an adaptive management cycle, right? Starting with conceptualizing what the conservation initiative will focus on and basically creating some parameters around it, developing goals and objectives for the landscape conservation effort, determining and developing planning products that will ideally inform local management plans, distributing those planning products and promoting their adoption. Hopefully, though this part is not always implemented, monitoring the adoption of those of those planning products, and then adapting the planning products and the planning process based on what is learned through all of and the analysis of these different stages, right? So ideally, you go through all 6 stages. In many cases and in many different arenas, unfortunately, you only go through basically the first 4, right? We don't always close the loop on the adaptive management cycle. But we're going to live in an ideal state today and talk about all these different stages. So starting with the conceptualization stage, this is really where there are basic parameters put around the purpose and intent of a landscape conservation initiative. And thinking about what I'll be speaking about here are best practices for local stakeholder engagement and integrating social data into the landscape conservation planning process. So during the conceptualization stage, it's really critical that there's a broad planning purpose, right? The planning purpose is why people are being brought together, generally what is the focus of the conservation, and developing a broad plan is integral because more stakeholders at the local level to see the relevance to them, right? A broad planning purpose can bring a lot of folks together. A broad planning purpose such as conserving water quality and quantity in a specific area, right? There's a lot of different groups that will resonate with. And it's really critical to speak to the goals and the interests of local stakeholders. Because if you don't speak to those goals and interests that are pertinent to local stakeholders, it's very unlikely that you'll get them to the table in the first place, right? Because time is our most valued resource and our most limited one. And so folks aren't going to spend their time on things that they don't see as relevant to them or their organizations or their priorities. And so just as an example, a planning purpose that is too narrow can exclude folks. So say there was one landscape conservation design effort that was on, in a coastal area. And because they didn't necessarily speak to focusing on hardened areas, there were many urban planners that didn't feel like this initiative was relevant to them, even though urban planners would have been really critical thought partners at the table. So by constraining the planning purpose, they unintentionally created a condition where some stakeholders didn't see the relevance and didn't come to the table. Really, really critical to a planning process is, first of all, having a leader, right? Ideally, who is committed on a full-time basis to conducting this work, to convening folks and to fostering collaborative processes and decision processes. But that leader really needs to be inclusive and seek out diverse perspectives and value those perspectives. If you have having that collaborative, inclusive leader is a really critical first step to getting folks to the table in the first place. Otherwise, you can kind of just go along with the status quo and have the usual suspects at the table, and nobody really notices that there aren't a diversity of voices represented necessarily. Another thing that I found most interesting, I think, about this research is this idea that when you consider defining the boundaries of your landscape, it's really important to think about what the social of that landscape are. Does a landscape have a social meaning? Because the literature and the research that we've conducted demonstrated that local stakeholders are much more likely to promote and support conservation actions in landscapes that they value and they understand and that they recognize. Having a sense of place, such as an emotional or a functional or an identity-based relationship with a landscape, is a very valuable antecedent to promoting conservation. And so the more you can understand definitions of landscapes, of areas within a landscape, and how and whether they resonate with local stakeholders, the more likely you'll get them to the table. And so to bring that kind of obscure idea to reality, so in the Green River Basin, nobody that I spoke with in the Green River Basin would have identified that they were from the Green River Basin. They were from the Wasatch Front or from the Uinta Basin, right? And so when you think about your landscape, if your landscape is ecologically defined in ways that it doesn't necessarily have a social resonance, doesn't really make sense to folks, they don't associate with being from that landscape, you might think about creating sub-regional or sub-landscape planning efforts in areas that are more socially meaningful, in areas that people recognize and can have a place attachment associated with. So instead of having an engagement that is the entire Green River Basin, which is basically impossible because it's so large, and then you end up excluding folks unintentionally because they just can't travel hours to get to every meeting, you can create sub-geographies where you engage folks. And they're more likely to get them to the table because they might have an association with that, value that place and recognize that place more. So another really critical thing to consider is what's the local capacity at the local level to get management done. It's get landscape conservation done across broad geographic areas if you have a social fabric in place, if you have conservation actors in place, right? Because then you can actually just leverage them. You can invite them to your planning process in a way that's respectful and seeks to not duplicate efforts or replace efforts, but really to add value. So, thinking about what's the social network and what's the social reality in the landscape is really critical. And not to say that you shouldn't try to do conservation in a landscape that doesn't have a lot of capacity. Landscape conservation can be a really, really fantastic driver of the development of relationships and partnerships that lead to transboundary resource conservation. But understanding the realities of the local socio-political landscape and whether conservation actors are there and what they're doing can be very valuable, because one thing that to really consider is that if you come into a landscape where there already is conservation underway, especially land like larger transboundary conservation, folks can feel very threatened. They can feel that you're coming in to replace them, and there can be a lot of resistance. So being really cognizant of what's happening in the conservation landscape at the local level can be really valuable to not, stepping wrong initially and creating unnecessary conflict or tension. When you're starting to think about what's happening in your landscape and starting to understand or try to understand what the local capacity is, it can be really, really important to do a situation assessment, where you assess what is the current ecological, economic, and social conditions in your landscape. What are the economic drivers? What are the threats to the ecological conditions and the social conditions and the economic conditions? Having an understanding of that, which can be done, based on reading newspapers and reports, and drawing on secondary data, can be just critical for understanding what would be feasible in this landscape. What are folks concerned about? What conservation actions would actually support local social, ecological, and economic needs, not just those that one might think theoretically are important. And once you conduct that situation assessment and you've defined your landscape, then you can understand more about who the local stakeholders you want to engage are, right? You have this, once you've identified the landscape, the resources that might be targeted, the general conservation objectives, the relevant folks with vested interests will become much more clear, right? Those are the local stakeholders who have vested interests, and they can be identified through, basically snowballing, right? Asking folks who they think are important stakeholders in the landscape, and lots of different methods to identify those stakeholders. And it's also really important in that process of identifying local stakeholders not to only focus on conservation organizations. It can be tons of different groups. It can be municipal groups that focus on economic conditions of the local economy, the local economic conditions. It can be energy development companies. Really thinking holistically about who is in the landscape, who would be impacted. That's how you identify those local stakeholders. So early on in the process of the conceptualization of a landscape initiative, you have to basically develop a development team, right? The folks that would be involved in the conservation planning at the landscape level. And ideally, that group would either engage local stakeholders directly or representatives of local stakeholders. And there's lots of advantages to that, right? More ground truth realities would be engaged in the conservation planning process. You have somebody embedded now who can communicate with their constituencies, and who can receive information from their constituencies and bring it back to the development team. So lots of benefits in that development team, including local stakeholders. It can also increase the legitimacy of the development team, right? Because oftentimes there's a lot of resistance to conservation that happens with folks that do not reside within the landscape. Communication is critical. The earlier you can communicate and start communicating about a landscape initiative, the better. And the more likely folks are to come to the table if they have heard about a landscape initiative and they're being engaged at the beginning and they're hearing about it in the beginning. And ideally, you're using a compelling narrative to communicate about the landscape initiative. And the narrative is basically sort of the general function and the organizational principles of a landscape initiative. And the broader your narrative, the more likely it is that local stakeholders will be able to see themselves and their values in that narrative. So the national heritage areas, for example, seek to conserve nationally historically valuable sites within America. A very, very broad purpose, and the narrative that's associated with those national heritage areas really draws in a lot of stakeholders, right? So they've been really successful at getting a lot of folks on board. Communications teams can be really instrumental to actually having systematic updates and iterative communications. It often is very labor intensive, and so having communication teams is really strategic. Consulting stakeholders regarding their preferences for participation can be critical to getting them to the table, right? You can't just assume that folks are going to be available 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, right? They may have seasonal dependencies on, whether they're farmers and they have harvest seasons or they have fire seasons or whatever it may be. Consulting with stakeholders about how they want to be engaged, how often they want to be engaged is very respectful and will lead to the most successful engagements. And finally, identifying and addressing barriers to local stakeholder participation, whether it's the travel distance to a meeting, whether it's financial constraints, whether it's organizations' ability to basically planning out, identifying those barriers and seeking to is really critical. Folks may be very willing to come to the table, but just not able to because of those barriers. So addressing those barriers up front can be very powerful. So moving on to establishing goals, which are basically what the intended outcome of the planning process is, and the objectives, which is how basically the measurable means that they'll achieve those goals. So in order to effectively engage local stakeholders and keep them engaged, it's really important to, at the beginning of the goal setting process, when you're really starting to engage local stakeholders effectively, you want to really be clear about their role. Manage expectations. Will different engagement types have different, will they have different roles and different engagement processes? So like a webinar might have a different, local stakeholders might have a different role in a webinar versus a public meeting, for example. And so just communicating that role in planning can really help the local stakeholders understand and manage their own expectations and not be disappointed when if they don't feel that their contributions, say, have been as meaningfully incorporated as they hope to. A needs assessment was really critical prior to goal development. And understanding what are the current conditions of that local state, what are the desired future conditions that they desire for their areas within that landscape that you're targeting, and what are the gaps and between the current condition and the desired future condition that need to be addressed, right? So that needs assessment can really lead to what would be the most pragmatic goals and targets for a conservation planning effort. And it really ensures that the planning effort is grounded in the realities of the local context. You may theoretically think that a conservation target is a great one, but in practicality, it just is not that important to local stakeholders. It doesn't have a lot of impact for local stakeholders, or it's only a theoretically and just not intellectually, not pragmatically valuable focus. So basically, you'd want to draft the conservation targets for landscape conservation planning based on the situation and needs assessment, and then refine it based on consultation with stakeholders, right? So the Great Lakes Coastal Wetland did a great job of this, where they basically did a ton of secondary data analysis, looking at management plans throughout the area landscape. And then based on that, they came up with a list of potential targets, and then they refined it through consultation with local stakeholders. This enhanced sense of ownership within those stakeholders, it enhanced a sense of a willingness to participate in future efforts, and it really ground truthed what those targets and those conservation priorities would be for the conservation initiative. Using participatory mapping and scenario planning can be really powerful, participatory mapping, where you actually have a map either on a computer or on a piece of paper, where folks are able, local stakeholders are able to circle the areas they value and articulate why those areas are valuable, can be very powerful for prioritizing conservation targets and landscape and areas within the landscape. Then scenario planning can be used to basically shift the conservation planning process from very theoretical to very outcome oriented, right? So large landscapes are, can be quite abstract, but if you go through a scenario planning process where you actually say, okay, if we have these goals and we have these objectives and we follow through with them, here's the outcome and here's how it would actually look on the ground. And having those conversations that are based on understanding the outcome can really make this a much more concrete concept for local stakeholders and really help them and the development team think through what is really needed in terms of conservation goals and what should we really be aiming for. And finally, it's following up with stakeholders after engagements is just really instrumental. If you have a process where basically you ask for engagement and then you don't tell them how their input is being incorporated, you don't even tell them how the engagement went necessarily, it creates a black box effect, which is very alienating to local stakeholders. And so the more that we can do to communicate progress, can just communicate iteratively, even honestly, if there's not a ton to communicate, just touching base on a regular basis, sending out news, like, kind of not flyers certainly, but, newsletters on some type of, quarterly or iterative basis can just help remind local stakeholders that this conservation effort's ongoing, that their contributions were really appreciated. Here's how they're being considered. And here's the next steps for the planning process. So keep an eye here. So moving on to determining and developing the planning products, these are the outcomes of the planning process. It's the biggest thing to promote adoption of innovations is to understand the needs of your end users. So identifying what the end users, what those resource practitioners at the ground level really need to inform their management planning is critical. And not assuming that really complex models will always fit the bill or that a map will fit the bill, and being flexible with what the outcome and not predetermining what that outcome will be is really critical to adoption, right? So processes where the outcome was very much presupposed can lead to situations where there are plenty of implementation gaps because the planning products just aren't useful to end users and they're not adopted. Ultimately, it's really valuable to iteratively refine the form and the function of the planning products based on feedback from end users. And if you can prototype, make basically an initial version of your planning product and then shop it around with your end users. Say here's an opportunity to use this. We'd love if you could, provide your name when you download this, say, decision support tool, and we'll follow up with a survey, or you can let us know how it goes. We'd love to, help support you, and we'd love to iteratively update this planning product based on your feedback. That can be really critical, right? Because you can't just assume that it's one and done, that you put something out there and it'll be adopted. You have to be willing to refine it iteratively to really ensure that it serves the needs of your end users. And then ultimately, even in a landscape conservation planning process, developing an implementation strategy can be incredibly important, right? And that by an implementation strategy, basically, the planning team, the development team thinking, okay, who do we need to leverage to get this work implemented? What is our strategy for communication? What is our strategy for distribution of our planning products? Having a plan like that in place can force the planning team, the development team, to sort of think about the theory of change. How are they really intending their process of planning to inform local management action? And thinking very critically about that outcome, instead of kind of being caught in the planning process, which, as can be very theoretical, can be great and fun, but is not outcome oriented necessarily. So that implementation strategy really helps the development team focus on the end users and focus on how they're going to get this work implemented on the ground. During the distribution and promotion of products, it's ideal to target local stakeholder groups to communicate the availability of the planning product. Targeting can really help speak directly to the goals and objectives of the local stakeholders, which can in turn increase the likelihood that those planning products will be adopted. It's very important to address and acknowledge financial barriers to implementation, and to the degree possible, development teams can help support local stakeholders financially, either by providing funding directly The development teams can themselves compete for funding opportunities, which they can distribute to local stakeholders. That's what happened in the landscape conservation design effort in the Great Lakes, where they got Great Lakes restoration funding, which they distributed to the local stakeholders. And or it may be even just like providing links to a range of grants that local stakeholders can apply to themselves to get the management implemented on the ground. And then using demonstration sites can be really valuable for innovation adoption, for adoption of these planning products, because folks can go and see what it looks like on the ground, right? What the reality is of implementing management that supports landscape conservation goals. And that seeing your colleagues, seeing your peers implement management can be very, very valuable for promoting the likelihood that others will adopt the planning products. Now onto this aspirational stage of monitoring adoption. So ideally, you're monitoring how products are being used, and you want to solicit feedback from that will inform product refinement by basically asking folks when they download a product from a website to provide their email, so you can send them an email or a survey, ask them how it's going, ask them if they have any feedback, and then in that, whether or not the collaborative landscape conservation planning products are being adopted and why, and really evaluate critically why maybe they're not being adopted and how they need to be refined to foster more adoption. And a really great tool for fostering communication amongst peers is to get testimonials from product end users. So those can be basically how the end users are using these tools. And just it can be like a short video or a short written statement about how these planning products have informed their management planning and how they've benefited from using these planning products. And again, that peer-to-peer learning can really foster adoption. Then finally, at this stage of adapting and planning the planning products and process, you really want to adapt the planning process and products based on the feedback from end users and the analysis of changes in the social and ecological conditions of your landscape. You can't assume that a landscape conservation tool will be effective, useful, and usable in perpetuity, especially if you have massive ecological, economic, or social changes, such as the ones that we've experienced in the last year with COVID, right? You can't assume that the planning products, that the landscape looks exactly the same year to year. And so iteratively assessing whether there have been major changes in your landscape and whether there need to be updates to the planning products that reflect those changes can be extremely valuable. And then ultimately, you really want to be able to adapt the planning products over time, right? To make them sure that they're useful to local stakeholders. And you have to think about what capacity do you have in place to adapt over time. Because if you don't have the capacity in place over time, your planning products end up being stagnated, right? And they ultimately will be adopted potentially for a period of time by local stakeholders, but then they may wane in their relevance and usefulness to local stakeholders. So all that said, the intent of the guide, the practitioner's guide that I spoke about today, was to help reduce planning implementation gaps. It was to help ensure collaborative landscape conservation planning processes reflect good environmental governance, and to promote the success and sustainability of the collaborative landscape conservation model. And I sent a link to Jonathan with the practitioner's guide link, and I think it's also in the announcement for today's webinar. But with that, I would just like to say some thank yous to all the fantastic interview participants with whom I could absolutely not have done this work. The Human Dimensions branch of the Fish and Wildlife Service, who funded this research and were fantastic partners in this work. I had a great, fantastic advisory team for this guide, and as well as my academic advisory committee. Great community of practice at Cornell, within the Cornell's Center for Conservation and Social Science, and also to the Shared Stewardship and to the Human Dimensions communities at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the U.S. Forest Service, where I currently work, and whose advice and contributions I always deeply value. And with that, I would love to open it up for questions.
Catherine, thank you so much. So much wonderful content in there, and really appreciate you sharing your perspectives and insights. I'll encourage folks to continue to submit questions via the chat box and the question and answer box. But I'm going to use my prerogative, Catherine, as host to pitch you a question to get us started. And I'm always fascinated by questions of scale when thinking about this work. And the scale at which we need to be thinking about collaborative landscape conservation, you're talking about places like the Great Lakes region, or even the Connecticut River Valley. These are very, very large geographies and places. And then on the other side, when we're talking about engaging local stakeholders, that's a much finer, more intimate level of engagement, and often turns on trust and relationship and connection. And so I'm curious to hear you reflect on sort of that tension between the scale at which we need to be working to be ecologically impactful, and then also the finer scale at which we need to attend to human connection and human relationship, and how those can come together effectively in moving us forward towards our broader goals.
Well, John, it's a really good question. And I think if I had the answer to it, I might win the Nobel Prize. So I'm going to try. It's a really, really important question, right? Just like these scale discordance issues, right? Where the scales are so different. And first of all, I want to say that we are so lucky in this day and age to have the technological know-how to really be able to model and assess conservation realities at landscape scales, at these huge geographic scales. At the Forest Service, one of the ways that we're addressing wildfire risk is to break the landscape into what are called fire sheds, right? And so we think about those fire sheds as discrete units where we can make an impact on fire risk. But as you said, the realities are that the relationships are formed at the ground level. And so what's really, really critical then is network governance, right? Ensuring that there is a network that leads all the way from the development team who are doing the landscape conservation planning down to the local stakeholders, and there's continuity in that network. And what can be really, really valuable, right, is having local stakeholder representatives on the development teams. So they're constantly thinking about and being grounded in those local realities, and they're in touch with constituency groups or with stakeholder groups that they are, they run with, and they can constantly be checking in with those folks. So the reality is that you can't have relationships at a landscape scale, but you can have relationships between individuals who think about those landscape scales. And if you form relationships with the folks in those development teams, form their relationships with folks that are going all the way down to the ground level, all those different levels, there just has to be connections, right? And so things like, the Network for Landscape Conservation, I will highlight your organization as a critical partner in this work. Your bridging organization, Network for Landscape Conservation as a bridging organization functions to bring together organizations which ultimately might not have been given the opportunity to connect and collaborate in the first place. And so organizations like the Center for Landscape Conservation, the Network for Landscape Conservation, can be critical partners in that. And ultimately, it's about forming relationships and ties at all those institutional levels, at the huge geographies, all the way down to the ground level, and just constantly working on those relationships. Because as you said, it all comes down to the social realities and the socio-political realities, whether or not this work can be implemented.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much, Catherine. Sort of a related question I see coming in through the chat is picking up on a lot of what we've been talking about is sort of institutional connections here. And a question from a participant wondering if there are any good examples of projects that you could point us to learn about where the sort of the end user or the implementation, success of implementation depends less on sort of institutional participants, but more on private individuals or private landowners. Do you have thoughts or examples to steer us to?
Well, so I'll point to the Northeast first of all. So the Northeast has this huge contiguous landscape of forests, right, that are almost all privately owned. And there are fantastic bridging organizations and conservation organizations that bring together the landowners of those northern forests. The specific name of the organization, I can't recall right now, but there are other places in our country, right? Nevada is like 84% publicly owned versus Indiana, which I think is 0.4% publicly owned. So there are huge landscapes and states where private conservation is the only name of the game, right? And there, so Natural Resource Conservation Service, which is the USDA's private lands arm, which engages directly with private landowners, their landscape initiatives are another great success, where the NRCS has formed relationships with local stakeholders. They have collaboratively prioritized landscapes for resource and species conservation, but they, at the local level, are forming relationships with landowners who are developing management plans that are then implemented to support those landscape conservation goals. So I would look to landscapes where there are a lot of private ownership to really highlight how private landowners can really contribute to this work.
Great, thank you. And Catherine, one of two organizations I think you may have been referring to in the Northeast. There's the Staying Connected Initiative,
Mm-hmm.
2 Countries, 1 Forest, or the Wildlands and Woodlands Initiative out of Highstead Foundation.
Absolutely, all of those, all of the above.
Yeah, great. A really great question here, Catherine. You spoke a lot about the polycentric notion and ethos of this work and how critical that is. Curious to hear thoughts on how do you best get leadership that is not dominated by one group, and usually a leader is coming to the table from a group that has commitments or perceived commitments that might skew the emphasis of the plan or create the perception that the plan is driven by one entity or one individual. So reflections or thoughts on finding that leader and how do you get leadership that is polycentric in practice?
Yeah, it can start with not having one leader, right? You can have a collaborative leadership, right? You can have entire boards that are the governing body that share responsibility, equally, or you could have, 2 to 3 individuals who are the co-directors of a landscape conservation effort. So just to draw on an example, in the Green River Basin, I believe in the Green River Basin, the collaborative process was directed between the Bureau of Reclamations and the Fish and Wildlife Service. So just inherently by sharing that power, it made it so that no one organization was dominant. But also having kind of, having a board govern or having a board that is, that the director is accountable to can also help ensure that there isn't, say, mission drift, that there isn't resource dependency that's creating, that's sort of driving the priorities of the work. It's a really important question. I mean, one that is really important in part because there are inherent inequities in power across organizations, right? Based on whether, their geographic authority, right? Based on how much money they have, based on how much social and, social legitimacy they have. And so an organization like the Nature Conservancy versus a small land trust, right? There's inherent power inequities there. But I think being aware and cognizant of those power inequities and seeking to really address them and not another potential way to address that is to have some critical figure in leadership be rotating, right? You have one person who's ideally consistent, but then you have other folks who rotate in and out of authority. And so that can really help ensure that it's not just one organization's prerogatives and priorities that are being prioritized.
Great, thank you, Catherine. A really wonderful question here, reflecting on the differing worldviews and values that, for instance, Indigenous or tribal participants might bring to the table versus Western ecological worldviews and perspectives, and how that can inform a planning process, or even around language like owners or managing resources, and how does a planning process need to be approached differently or rethought entirely to incorporate and create space for that tribal or Indigenous perspective?
Yeah, that's an incredibly important question. And local ecological knowledge is just so powerful, right? Not only because it reflects eons of understanding of the landscape, but it also speaks to large communities that are hugely valuable in the conservation work. So I think that the first step, and it seems very obvious, but engage those folks early and often, right? Space for them. In this day and age, that space has to be created. I would say that basically just creating opportunities for social learning and ensuring that there isn't a dominance necessarily, isn't always the dominance of the Western perspective. That has to be a deliberate decision on the part of leadership. And that leadership has to communicate, and basically the development team has to be willing and understanding of how to incorporate. But I think that the more that we can do to engage early and often, and have tribal consultation first, where that's necessary, government to government. Certainly, that's a different matter. But when we can engage tribal, and indigenous constituents in both development teams and as local stakeholders, there will inherently be tensions in the system. There'll inherently be sometimes conflicting perspectives. But simply valuing and acknowledging them and introducing them can be a really, really critical first step. But that's a very immature answer to a really fantastic question that I would love to explore. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. I'm going to try to stitch two questions into one here and pitch you a complicated question that you'll have a couple minutes to answer. So not sure I'm setting you up for success here, Catherine, but a question about network governance. And my sense is that listening to you speak, that's a really critical piece. And do you have examples of good network governance that you could point to determine the flow of information and decision making and that sort of thing up and down, and then sort of marrying that question to one that is interested in exploring that, bridging that gap between landscape, sort of conventional conservation organizations that are focusing on a landscape, and creating space to bring in non-conventional conservation partners, and really embracing that social construct meaning of a landscape that you introduced, Catherine, and how you can do that effectively in the early stages of project development or planning. So I see those as two sort of related questions, but curious to hear if you do too, and any reflections or thoughts you might have on that front.
Absolutely. So one of my favorite scholars in the network governance arena is Patrick Bixler, who's very much involved in the Network for Landscape Conservation. And just in terms of highlighting a specific organization or effort, the Crown of the Continent is one that works extremely well through network governance. They have teams that basically, very deeply involved in planning, and then they have these different rings that move out in terms of their constituencies and their contacts and who they engage with at the local level. So I would definitely point to that as a really fantastic example of network governance. In the federal systems, you also have an inherent network governance because you have federal governments that work at a national scale, at a regional scale, at a local scale, right? So there's inherently governance in network governance within those organizations that can bleed out to partnerships that also work at all those different institutional levels. So the landscape conservation cooperatives did a really nice job of managing between, the really high level coordinating teams, the development teams working on landscape conservation design, and partners at the local level who were implementing management on the ground. And I would love to follow up with just a paper I wrote on basically a theory towards local stakeholder engagement, which really speaks to actions at those different institutional levels and how they can be connected. And to your second question about how to consider that diversity of perspectives and not just necessarily the traditional conservation groups, just think about, one critical first step is think about the economic realities in your landscape, right? Not just, there's a lot of controversy over thinking about economic conditions when it comes to environmental, endangered species, of course, but when it comes to, what's going to be managed on the ground, what's going to be implemented, what's going to be feasible, what's going to be supported, look at the economy, right? Include folks from, municipal organizations that focus on local economies, on county level economies. So, county commissions have, folks that focus specifically on the economy. There are local economic, a number of different folks that will think specifically about the business, about the economy, and just, that's a little bit vague, but just not thinking only about the species, right? It's really about how does the species fit into the whole context of the social, ecological, and political realities and economic realities of that local landscape. And now that I've led us to the end of our time together on that question.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Catherine. It's just a real pleasure to have you today. And thank you so much on behalf of the network for joining us today. And thanks to everyone that joined our conversation today and brought forward these fantastic questions. Catherine's contact information is on the slide I see here. And I'm sure, I hope I'm not speaking out of turn, Catherine. I'm sure Catherine would be more than happy to connect with anyone afterwards. And look forward to continuing the conversation. As I said at the top of the call, this is one of an event in our ongoing webinar series, Landscape Conservation in Action webinar series that the Network for Landscape Conservation is hosting. And we're thrilled to continue to bring these events forward. Our next event is scheduled for later this month, June 24th, and we'll be hearing from some folks at the Trust for Public Lands about how to incorporate urban land protection as part of a more comprehensive, holistic approach to landscape conservation. So that promises to be another very, very rich conversation. But let me end today with just a thank you to everyone that participated, and especially thank you, Catherine, for coming and sharing your thoughts. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been such a pleasure to see you, to engage with this group. Thank you so much to everybody in the virtual room, and have a wonderful and safe day.
Thanks, Catherine.